Welcome and thank you so much for coming today to a discussion with Dr. Reza Aslan. The discussion is Religion, Politics, and Literature in the Middle East. My name is Kate Chester, and I oversee community relations and public relations for the Slovenia campus. This is an honor, a real treat for us to have Dr. Aslan visit PCC. So thank you so much for coming, Dr. Aslan.
My pleasure.
To give you a bit of background about him, Dr. Aslan was born in Iran and now lives in Los Angeles, where he's an associate professor of creative writing at the University of California, Riverside. He's perhaps more widely known as an internationally acclaimed writer and scholar of religions, and he's also a contributing editor at the Daily Beast. Dr. Aslan's first book, in 2005, was the international bestseller, No God But God, The Origins, Evolution, and Future of Islam, which I've got right here with me. It garnered all kinds of accolades. It was translated into 13 languages and was named as one of the 100 most important books of the decade. He's also the author of How to Win a Cosmic War and editor of Tablet and Pen, Literary Landscapes from the Modern Middle East. He has degrees in religion from Santa Clara University, Harvard University, and the University of California, Santa Barbara, as well as a Master of Fine Arts from the University of Iowa. Today's presentation stems from the hard work of Brian Hull, who is, many of you know him, but for those of you who don't, he is a composition and literature instructor here at PCC Slovenia. He also serves as the faculty coordinator of the college's internationalization initiative, and today's event came together after about a year plus of hard work on his part. So we thank him very much for doing the organization.
We're going to start with a reading out of Reza's anthology. I'm going to have you read it, if you don't mind.
Sure.
First of all, tell us a little bit about the writer, and then if you could read the first two stanzas of his poem.
Sure, let's see, who did you pick? Nima Usij. Nima Usij is an Iranian poet, was quite famous in the early part of the 20th century for really popularizing free verse in Iranian poetry. Really one of the first people to I think, take Iranian poetry to the point of modernism. And like so many poets before him, and after him certainly, really used his poetry as a form of social criticism in Iran. This is quite a famous poem of his called O People, Nima Usij. O people who are sitting cheerful and laughing on the shore, someone is losing his life in the sea. Someone is struggling in the rough, dark, and formidable sea. Just when you are intoxicated with the thought of conquering your enemies, when you are deluding yourself that by helping one poor man you are building prosperity for all, when you are girding up your loins for some endeavor of what other concern of yours should I speak? Yes, all this while someone's life is being needlessly sacrificed in the sea. O people who have exhilarating time on the shore, your tables bountiful, your bodies well clothed. Someone in the sea is calling for help. He is buffeting the heavy waves with his exhausted hands. He is grasping for breath, his eyes bulging out of their sockets in terror. Water has filled his inside in the dark deep, and in his growing distress, out of the water he thrusts, now his head, now his feet. O people. He tries not to lose sight of this old world from far away, and with the hope of some help he cries out. O people who are enjoying the view from the peaceful shore. Waves rush in, pounding on the silent shore, toppling like drunken men, lying sprawled out, unconscious, and then, roaring, they retreat into the sea. Again, the same cry comes from far away. O people. And the wind has a more tormenting sound, and the cry of the man in the sea is spreading out in the sound of the wind. And from the midst of the water, close and distant, again this cry echoes, O people.
Okay, what's going on today? It's hard to keep up. I feel like if I miss a day, I missed a lifetime. So what's going on in Libya and elsewhere, and what should we be paying particular attention to, and why?
Well, I mean, obviously it's been a pretty dramatic couple of months. I mean, not even 2 months, really. I mean, all of this in some ways started in Tunisia in the middle of December. I would say actually the paradigm itself was set in 2009 with the Green Movement in Iran. And while we do have to think about these different countries, whether it's Libya or Tunisia or Egypt or Iran or Yemen or Bahrain or now Oman, soon to be Algeria, perhaps Morocco, hopefully Syria, while we do have to think about all of these countries differently because they all have different societal structures, they have different economic structures, and certainly what's going on in Libya is vastly different than what happened in Tunisia or Egypt or what have you. The thing that all of these countries have in common is twofold. One is this massive youth bulge, an unprecedented youth bulge in the Middle East. You're talking about a region from Morocco to Turkey to Iran that's about 75% under the age of 35. It's 3/4 of the population under the age of 35, about half the population under the age of 25. The median age in Egypt is 24. The median age in Tunisia is 23. The median age in Yemen is 18. This is an incredibly young population. And unlike their parents' generation, this is a population that cannot be sort of isolated any longer. They have access to new media technologies, obviously the internet, social media sites like Facebook and Twitter and YouTube. They also have access to satellite television, and they through their mobile phone technologies can communicate with each other in ways that would have been unimaginable even a few years ago. In other words, what we are seeing now is this profound shift taking place in a region in which, for the most part, the levers of communication had been under the control, in fact, really monopolized by these authoritarian regimes. And if you can control communication, you can control your people. If they have no way of either communicating with each other or communicating with the outside world, you're in charge. You control what happens. When that control slips, it's over. And what we're seeing now is not just a young, restive, disenfranchised population that's politically conscious, that's socially active, it's technologically savvy, it sees what's going on in the world around it, and it wants it for itself. But more importantly, they now have the means to organize, to come together, and to break precisely that grip over communication that I was referring to. And that's a volatile situation. So we do have to treat all of these countries differently, and I'm happy to talk about them, one by one, because they should all be thought about separately. But ultimately what they all have in common is this phenomenon that I've been talking about for 5-6 years, and that is this wave that is crashing on our shores, made up of this young, restive population whose aspirations have to be met. Otherwise, we're all going to have to deal with this problem. And so this is just getting started. This is by no means over. I mean, Libya is certainly next, but already we're looking at what's going on in Oman. I think also we should keep an eye on Algeria as well.
I like that you, a wave that's crashing upon our shore, you already are pulling in the themes of the poem. I'm going to ask I want to go fast for just a little bit, and I just want to get your take on it, and then we can
start with the speed round.
Yeah, we're doing speed dating really fast. Okay, Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, serious problem or not as serious problem as you might think?
Well, it's certainly not as serious as a problem as, say, Glenn Beck thinks. Glenn Beck, who, this guy, talk about evil genius. He has managed to figure out a way to connect the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt to Code Pink in the United States all as sort of one single conspiracy, which is, brilliant how you make that connection. The Muslim Brotherhood is obviously a religiously conservative group. Their values are not my values.
But you hear all the time, like, they're the ones who are organized, no one else is organized. We need to be worried that they're organized.
That's true. This is what's so fascinating about what's happening right now, is that when you, a month ago, less than that, 2 months, let's just say about 2 months ago, if you had told me, what is the hope for an opposition to Mubarak's dictatorship, the only answer is the Muslim Brotherhood, because they're the only organization that's even remotely organized in Egypt. You have to understand that Egypt is a society in which, until quite recently, any hint of democratic participation or democratic organization was dealt with in the harshest way possible. And particularly if that sort of push came from sort of a liberal or secular movement, like, for instance, the Kafaya movement, or, for instance, Ayman Nour's, who's probably Egypt's most famous democracy activist, his organization, really the only open society, the only free space in a place like Egypt is the mosque. And that's been the case for the last 50 years. So it's only natural, if the only free space in society is the mosque, that the only opposition, the only organized opposition to the regime is going to be mosque-based, and therefore religiously based. That's a phenomenon that one sees throughout the region. And so, yes, indeed, the Muslim Brotherhood was the most well-organized, largest, and sort of most cohesive opposition to Mubarak. But here's the fascinating thing. They had nothing to do with bringing Mubarak down. Nothing. They didn't start the protests. The protests started on January 25th. The Muslim Brotherhood actually boycotted the protests. They wanted nothing to do with it because they thought, well, we're getting a little bit of political power by just kind of keeping our heads down and being quiet and joining in the electoral process. They even refused to boycott the elections the way that Mohammed al-Baradei, the former head of the IAEA, who came to Egypt to sort of lead the democracy movement, as though it needed a leader. It doesn't. He asked for them to boycott the election. The Muslim Brotherhood wouldn't. It took the Muslim Brotherhood a good 10 days to finally realize what was going on. And then they kind of were really late into the game, and they joined a movement already in process. They never led that movement. That's what's really fascinating about it. But let's be clear.
And remember, this is the speedy part.
Trust me, this is me talking. This is a short answer, believe it or not. No. But let's be clear. The Muslim Brotherhood is going to have a role to play in the future Egyptian government. They do represent about 25% of the population. And the vast majority of Egyptians, 95%, according to a recent Pew poll, want religion to play a greater role in their government than it has been under Mubarak. At the same time, the latest straw poll that was given in Egypt was just sort of a fun presidential straw poll to see who, in a general election for president, would get elected. The Muslim Brotherhood got 1%. 1. So that's what's happening. The old people are useless as far as these young revolutionaries are concerned. They have no interest in institutions. They have no interest in, the institutions, whether they're religiously focused or liberal and secular focused. To them, it's all the same. And that's what's phenomenal about what's taking place right now, is that the old guard is becoming increasingly irrelevant.
Cool. America's response to events in Libya: too little, just right, too much.
This is a really difficult point for the Obama administration to find itself. It cannot engage in another conflict in the Middle East. That can't happen under any circumstances. People have been asking for, at the very least, a no-fly zone, and that's understandable, but that's a little bit more complicated than people make it sound. They make it sound as though we just put a couple of aircraft carriers in the Mediterranean and shoot down any Libyan plane that we see, in the skies. It's much more complex than that. And it will for sure involve military engagement. You can't have a no-fly zone unless you're willing to shoot people down. And if you're willing to shoot people down, then you're willing to be shot at, and we're not willing to be shot at. So I think they've done the right thing with this regard. The travel bans, the freezing of the assets, the arms embargo, those things have had an effect. Not on Gaddafi. Let's be clear. Gaddafi is a lunatic, and I mean that quite literally. I don't mean he's crazy, like Mubarak is crazy. I mean that if Gaddafi weren't the dictator in Libya, he'd be in a rubber room playing with his poop. That's what I mean. He is insane, literally insane. And so you're not going to pressure him. There is nothing any human being on earth can do in order to pressure Muammar Gaddafi. So there's no reason to bother trying. But we can pressure his interior circle. We can pressure the people around him, those who have, for one reason or another, decided to remain loyal to him. And that's what we've done. I think this is what Obama has done that's been quite clever, is that he didn't just freeze Gaddafi's asset. He froze everyone's assets. Anyone near Gaddafi has had their assets frozen. All his sons have had their assets frozen, up to about $30 billion, it seems like. So this is only going to end. I mean, I want to be as clear about this as I possibly can. This is only going to end with a bullet in Gaddafi's brain. There is no other way that this will end. And we're not going to do it. So we're doing everything in our power to get someone else to do it, someone near him to do it. And that's the plan. I mean, that is literally the plan that we have in place. So I don't think you're going to see anything more than that.
Cool. Egypt's changing relationship with Israel, significant shift or not so significant shift?
Significant insofar as you're not going to have, a Hosni Mubarak who will continue to get paid $2 billion a year from American taxpayers in order to do Israel's bidding. That's not going to happen anymore. But not significant in the way that I think a lot of people have been worried about, insofar as, well, if Mubarak is no longer the strong man in Egypt, then the peace process between Israel and Egypt goes out the door. No, that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen for a couple of reasons. First of all, Egypt is a military dictatorship. It was a military dictatorship. The military was in charge when Mubarak was president, and the military will be in charge no matter who follows Mubarak. Certainly the military will be responsible for foreign policy. Mohammed al-Baradei or Amr Musa, these guys are not going to dictate Egypt's foreign policy. The generals will dictate Egypt's foreign policy. And it's the generals who receive $2 billion a year to be nice to Israel. And they are not going to, in any way, shape, or form, jeopardize that money. And so the peace treaty with Israel is going to be intact for sure. But Israel and Egypt are going to have a different kind of relationship. They're going to have a relationship based on the fact that if you're a democracy, then you're going to sort of be reflective of the mores and values and opinions of the majority of the population. And the majority of the Egyptian population do not like Israeli policy towards the Palestinians. So whereas during the embargo on Gaza, Mubarak was more than happy to sort of cut the Rafah crossing and allow the Gazans to essentially starve to death, that's not going to happen under a post-Mubarak regime. The other thing that you're not going to see is this plan that's been put in place ever since the Bush administration to create a core group of Arab allies who will pressure Iran on the side of Israel. That's been the plan, ever since the Bush administration, which was we get sort of the Saudis and the rest of the Gulf Arabs, and we get Jordan, and we get Egypt. We get these countries who are deathly afraid of Iran, that our leaders are deathly afraid of Iran and Iran's regional ambitions, and we create sort of an axis that pushes the balance of power towards Israel and away from Iran. That's over. So that we have to go back to the drawing board about how we're going to pressure Iran, because that plan is not going to work, because the Egyptian people don't have a problem with Iran. The people in Bahrain, the people in Saudi, the people in Yemen don't have a problem with Iran. It's the governments that have a problem with Iran. In fact, a recent poll showed almost 60% of Egyptians saying that an Iranian nuclear weapon would be a good thing for Egypt and for the region. So it's going to change the way business is done as usual, but insofar as the hysteria that one hears about how this is Al-Qaeda is going to take over these countries, absurd, ridiculous.
That was one of my questions.
Yes, ridiculous. Al-Qaeda has played no role. In fact, they have been left behind, as much as the Muslim Brotherhood by these movements. Or that this necessarily will lead to another all-out war between Egypt and Israel. These are absolutely not in the cards. Nobody in Egypt wants a fifth war with Israel. They've already fought 4 wars with Israel, and all 4 times they got slaughtered. I mean, they had their butts handed to them by Israel. The Egyptians aren't stupid. They're not going to do this a 5th time.
Okay. I want to read you, it's a memoir by a Pakistani writer who gets anthologized in U.S. literary anthologies, and he writes about the independence of India from the British. I guess he was there. At the time, neither side, the government or the people, was experienced. They were at each other's throats, unaware of the consequences. The government sent people to prison without understanding the implications of such a step, and those who submitted to voluntary arrest showed equal ignorance of the true significance of their act. It was wrong-headedness and potentially explosive. It ignited people, subsided, and ignited all over again, creating a surge of fiery exuberance in the otherwise dull and gloomy atmosphere of servitude. This is a little intro to, you hear all the time in the media, it's that the people who are doing the uprisings are inexperienced. And I wonder if you think that they're inexperienced, and does it matter that they're inexperienced?
Well, first of all, no, it doesn't matter. And also the other thing that doesn't matter, it's another criticism that you hear a lot, is that they're leaderless, right? Everybody's trying to find who is the leader amongst the opposition in Egypt or in Tunisia or in Yemen or whatever. The leader is Facebook. That's who the leader is. These kids don't want it. These kids don't want some, pardon me, old man to suddenly show up and say, I'm in charge. You saw this in Egypt. Everybody was willing, while the revolution was taking place, to sort of back Muhammad al-Baradei, because they figured, well, the West knows this man, and they're all, at the very least, we can put a face, to this opposition. But once Mubarak was gone, pretty much so was al-Baradei. These kids feel as though every leader that they have ever had, whether it's a government leader or a religious leader, has failed them miserably, that they're all corrupt, that they've all been, bastardized by the system. And so the only way to sort of fix society is to just get rid of that entire class, that entire generation. So this in Tunisia, when Ben Ali left, when the president left, what he left behind was essentially a caretaker government that was in the process of writing a new constitution and moving the transition towards democracy. And everyone thought, well, the kids will now go home, but they didn't go home. They said, no, we don't want the vice president, we don't want the prime minister, we don't want anyone. If you have shaken Ben Ali's hand, we don't want you there. And it worked. And the same thing, by the way, happened today. Ahmed Shafiq, who was the prime minister, who was basically running things once Mubarak left in Egypt, the protesters would not leave Tahrir Square until he was gone, and he stepped down today. They want everybody from the NDP, the entire political party, to be cleansed. And that's when they'll be finally satisfied. The issue about experience, though, I mean, this is a region, as you know, that's sort of steeped in revolution. It's steeped in, in Egypt, you saw a revolution, in the 1920s, you saw another one in the 1950s, and then now, of course, what we're seeing today. In Iran, you had 1905, you had 1953, you had 1979. We know we do that well. We know revolutions well. So I don't think experience is the issue.
But that's precisely my point. Like the revolution, you're experienced at, but you are experienced at. But then after the revolution, then comes the difficulties of running a country economically and politically, and that's when I say an experience. That's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, and certainly, it remains to be seen what kinds of vacuums will be filled in certain countries. Not in Egypt, as I say. In Egypt, no matter who's in charge, the military is in charge. So we should all feel fairly confident that Egypt is not going to disintegrate in any way, shape, or form. Libya, that's anybody's guess. Nobody knows what happens once Gaddafi goes, because he spent the last 4 decades making sure that there is nobody who could ever replace him. He's destroyed all civic institutions. There are no labor unions in Libya. The military is weak and divisive. The battalion leaders are all formed according to different tribes, so that they have no loyalty to any commander at all. Their loyalty is to their tribe. And if the tribe says, yeah, we're actually going to abandon Gaddafi, they abandon Gaddafi. It's as simple as that. They're poorly trained. We're seeing the results of this in the way that, they've mostly abandoned Gaddafi. And despite the fact that they have very few weapons, they have managed to maintain their positions against Gaddafi's army for the past week. So in Libya, who knows? But I will say this one thing, though. I think that fear is somewhat exaggerated about sort of what comes next for 2 reasons. One, those people who say that this is just an opening for what happened in 1979, right? In 1979, there was this pro-democracy movement in Iran that forced the American-backed dictator out of the country, and then there was a democratically elected provisional government that was running the show for about 8 months until everything collapsed, and then we saw the clerics step into the vacuum, and everything is history since then. The problem with that argument, though, that Egypt could become Iran or Libya could become Iran, is that if there is one thing that Egyptians and Libyans and frankly Arabs across the board agree on, is that Iran has been a despicable failure in every way, shape. Nobody wants to be Iran. It's not like Egyptians are looking around and saying, what would be great? We should do what Iran does. Yeah, since, let's see, in Egypt, our inflation rate is 12%. In Iran, it's 24%. In Egypt, the unemployment rate is 20%. In Iran, it's almost 40%. Every single economic indicator that led to this uprising in Egypt in the first place is worse in Iran. Nobody wants to be Iran. So I think that's a fear that doesn't have to be there at all. I disagree with that.
There's a poem in here in your anthology called Iranian Women, and it seems to be like couplets, and each couplet is kind of connected but kind of different. And there's one couplet that ends with, one's value does not rise and fall with high and low prices. So I'm wondering, do you think the attempts of the government to pay off their people in a variety of ways, like we were talking about at lunch, the suppression of food prices, is it going to work, and for how long?
I think it's going to work in Saudi. I think it's going to work in Qatar. These Gulf countries that are swimming in oil and have more money than God, and then very, very few citizens. There are very few Qataris. In the entire country of Qatar, there are probably 600,000 citizens. Qatar extracts 800,000 barrels of oil a day. So they can just simply pay off their citizens. In fact, that's precisely what the government in Qatar did. They gave just this last week, they gave every citizen $3,500. And so it's a bribe. That's precisely what it is. But the problem with these Gulf states like Saudi and Qatar is that the division between the haves and have-nots, which is so prevalent throughout that region, doesn't really exist within the citizenry. The citizens are privy to this sort of annual allowance that comes from doing nothing except being a citizen of the state. And so the real sort of the impoverished people in many of these Gulf countries are foreigners, are the Pakistanis, the Indians, the Filipinos, the guest workers, the people who are there who are treated really like slaves, like indentured servants, and who are not going to complain. Because if they complain, they just get thrown out, and there's an entire long line of Pakistanis waiting to fill their jobs. So the social situation in the Gulf is quite different, but it's not going to work anywhere else. I mean, really, what is at stake across North Africa and the Middle East is more than just economy. This is about dignity. This is about an understanding that your very voice that is completely stifled, that you have no say in your political, social, or economic destiny whatsoever, and the refusal to take it anymore. And now you have sort of a way, you have a platform, a paradigm through which you can actually make your voices heard.
Just to give people a context, we're going to talk about literature, and I don't want people to think, my God, how can they talk about literature when there's so much more important stuff going on?
On the contrary.
So could you talk about the role of literature historically in the last 100 years in the Middle East? Because I think it's different than how students here taking a lit class and reading American and European authors will think of the role of literature in European or American history.
I think you're absolutely right, and in fact, this is precisely what the book does. It's 100 years of literature, and it's divided into these three sections, and you can see how early in the 20th century literature was used, whether it's Arabic or Persian or Turkish or Urdu literature, as a means of pushing back against colonialism and Western imperialism, as a way of really creating a distinct national identity, an identity founded upon a set of symbols and metaphors that gave birth to the very concept of the nation state as we know it today. I mean, you look at, for instance, the great Turkish writers of the early part of the 20th century who were in crafting these beautiful poems and these short stories, were really defining the Turkish language, the modern Turkish language, stripping it of its flowery sort of Ottoman influences and stripping it of its Arabic and Persian influences and creating something that was uniquely, distinctly Turkish. And that language became a primary tool for identity formation. That's true everywhere. I mean, you can't have a national identity unless you all agree on, a national language. And so really the first part of the century, that's what you see. These poets, these writers are not just fashioning, wonderful works of literature. They're fashioning a wholly new identity as Arab, as Persian, as Pakistani, or as, Turkish. In the middle of the century, the irony, of course, is that these poets and writers whose words gave shape to these modern nation states very quickly became the primary enemies of those modern nation states, because those states themselves very quickly descended into various forms of authoritarianism, whether it's kingship or dictatorship or theocracy. And so, in a way, you had a situation, and this has really been the case throughout, most of the 20th century, in which you have societies where the freedom of speech, the freedom of the press are heavily curtailed, if not, just downright forbidden. And so in those kinds of societies, the poet becomes the journalist. The poet becomes the historian. The poet becomes the social critic. Literature itself becomes the mirror that is held up to society to show the failures and the ills of the present social system. And in some ways, the poets are the only people who can kind of get away with it because they're writing in symbols, they're writing in metaphors. The poem that I just read to you, the O People by Nima Usage, is a profoundly critical condemnation of the Iranian regime and its sort of push towards westernization and modernization and capitalism, even as the vast majority of Iranians were starving and not having any access to the sort of the life that the political elite was enjoying. And so he says, as you're sitting on the beach and your tables are full, there is someone drowning in the ocean and you're not doing anything about it. You can kind of get away with that if you're writing it in verse, if you're writing poetry. You can sort of get away with it. But if you write that as an op-ed, you will never be heard from again. So now, that said, let me be very clear that most of the writers in this book, most of the poets have been persecuted. Most of them, were thrown in prison. Many of them were executed for their writings. But that's what that's the sort of important nature of literature in a region where your voice is stifled is something that, as you sort of hinted, we kind of lost. In the United States, where we enjoy these kinds of freedoms in a way that we don't need necessarily our poets to sort of become our social critics. We've kind of lost that. We had that in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, and with the civil rights poets and the Beat generation, etc. But for the most part, it's a tradition that's just really not all that robust in American writing any longer.
I remembered a question I forgot to ask about politics, and I think it's an important one, so I'm going to go back. As I was listening to all these stories about what was going on, I was always thinking, well, what am I not hearing about? What is getting so de-emphasized in this reporting? Because there were a ton of reports on Muslim Brotherhood, relationship with Israel, rising food prices, stability versus instability. And I kept thinking, I'm getting this weird feeling I'm getting a version of this whole experience that's very American. And one of the things I could think of, because it's hard to think of something that you're not getting because you're not getting it, was I'm not hearing that much about what it was like to live in Egypt or Tunisia or any of these countries prior to what is going on. An average person. I'm not hearing very much at all. But I don't know. Do you think that our press has done a good job depicting the complexities of the issues, or do you think it's getting shaped in some ways that politically has ramifications in terms of who we vote for or who?
I mean, look, there's no such thing as objective press in the United States. It just doesn't exist really in any. I mean, I guess the closest you could come is NPR. But for the most part, I mean, this story is being spun according to the political leanings of whatever the media outlet happens to be. But I think you do have a point there about sort of what is not being told. I think first of all, I mentioned the most important thing is that this is a youth revolution. I mean, this is about a youth
but I've
revolt.
heard that. I mean, they have said that over and over again. Young people, blah, 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 social networking. I mean, that's, I think, been covered.
Good,
but,
you're reading the right sources.
Okay, but, like, so, I mean, besides that.
The issue, to go back to your earlier question, the issue about what life was like and why we're seeing what's happening now. you have to understand that you're talking about societies that were always stratified, but that stratification has become far more pronounced. A lot of the press reports have dealt with this as either an economic issue or a political issue. These are people who are poor, and so therefore, they're rising up because they want a better living standard. Or this is a democracy movement. These are people who are tired of having their voice stifled, and they want to have a say, in their political destinies. The thing is that we don't understand is how intimately those two things are united in this region, because your economic possibilities are inextricably linked to your political access in a place like Egypt. The only possibility you have of rising above your particular, place in society is by hooking up with someone who has political access to the Mubarak regime. All the wealth, all the property, all the power goes to that very high, political elite, that 1% that has managed to hitch its wagon to Mubarak and his inner circle. They're the ones who have the jobs, they're the ones who have the cars, they're the ones who have the houses, etc. So if you're a young person in Egypt and you're getting by on a few dollars and just barely figuring out a way, and you have to give, a handout and a tip to everyone and anyone just to get, through the most basic parts of your day, you make a very clear connection in your mind. The only way that I will ever rise from my economic situation is if I too have political power, if I have some political control. So, hence democracy. That's what a democracy means that we all get a voice, right? Well, then that's what I want. I want a voice. I want a voice because having a political voice will necessarily give me some economic, abilities. Now, we in the United States know that's not true. And there is, I think, an inevitable deflation, let's say, that's going to happen when Egyptians realize that too. It's the same thing we saw actually in Eastern Europe, after the wave of democracy and the inevitable kind of disappointment that actually I'm still poor. I'm still in the same circumstances that I was before. I think that's something that's inevitable. But we can, the United States, forestall that by recognizing that we played no role in these protests, right? We played no role in the revolutions taking place across the Middle East. We played no role in the thirst for democracy that we're seeing amongst these young people. We're out of it. That's a good thing. That's why it's worked, by the way. But we can play a very important role in what comes next by investing in the civilian infrastructure and the economic infrastructure of these new states, by making sure that we can help in the economic stability that's going to be necessary, particularly in a place like Egypt. We give $2 billion a year right now, $2 billion every year to the Mubarak regime and now to the Egyptian military. 99%, and I'm not just exaggerating, literally 99% of that $2 billion is spent on weapons, and American weapons, by the way. It's a wonderful process that we do. We give you $2 billion with which you buy our weapons. And those weapons are given to the Egyptian military. Let's see, why? Does Egypt have an external enemy? Is Egypt fighting a war against Libya? Of course not. Egypt has no external enemy. Those weapons are not meant to protect Egypt from an outside enemy. They're meant to protect Mubarak from its inside enemy, from his own people. What if we took a little bit of that money? Let's just a little bit. I'm not talking about, $1 billion, just a little tiny bit, and began investing instead in the civilian infrastructure and the economic infrastructure of Egypt. Then we can ensure that these young people who have risked their lives to create a society that provides them with a sense of dignity, that they get something out of it, that something comes out of the end of this whole process.
So we're almost to our question and answer period. So I want to ask one more question. And it has to do, having listened to you on radio programs and listened to where the conversation went, and listened to lots of other programs where there was a guest who either was an authority on Islam, but mostly it was when the guest was Muslim. I noticed that there was, we'd always come back to having to defend Islam for the predictable 5 reasons. Like, it was always like the 5, which you could probably in your head. And I thought to myself, I wonder if,
Does that get exhausting? Yes.
Yes. And does it, do you get really angry? I mean, is it irritating that you have to? Yeah. And one of the things, when I was in Morocco and I was walking around with this guy around the streets of Tangier, he said at the very beginning, no topic is taboo. You can ask anything. And so I asked lots of questions, and he was right. He didn't like bulk at anything and say, but, like, not that or something. So one of the things I asked was, when do you feel the closest to God? And after I asked it, and he answered it very easily, like I was asking him, like, are we going to eat lunch today? I thought, we never ever get to those kinds of questions because we're spending all of our time either defending or asking accusatory questions. And so I wonder if you ever think about, like, wow, all the stuff I never get to talk about. Do you think about that?
Well, it seems like I'm always talking. So, it's like I never stop talking. So it's, but I do think about that a lot. I miss the days when I could talk about, God. Those were fun conversations. It doesn't happen anymore. But to the sort of larger issue about finding oneself in a situation in which I'm somehow responsible for, answering for the actions of 1.5 billion people. I used to get annoyed and I used to get upset at it, but now I just sort of recognize it as what it is. I mean, it's sort of the world in which we live, and it, in a sense, has become the responsibility of, I think, every Muslim in the United States to have to, represent Islam, as absurd and as unfair as that statement sounds. I mean, no one would ever expect, every Jew in America to answer for Israeli aggression in the occupied territories. It'd be ridiculous. And yet, this is the situation that we're in. And so, to be honest, I've kind of given up on complaining about it, and now I just sort of grin and bear it.
Okay, so I lied. I have one more question. Because I do want to talk about God.
Let's talk about God.
Just because you say you never get to do it anymore.
Yeah.
Okay, so in your first book, it was an odd thing to read in that you had the secular historical approach to the whole question of the beginnings of Islam, and then occasionally, so that was the typical thing. I've read so many academic books where the whole thing is approached from a very secular, sociological thing. And so there was that part. But then occasionally there were these moments where it got extremely spiritual. And those two things don't exist oftentimes in the same book.
That's true.
And so what was it like to write that? I mean, I didn't know.
Well, look, I am a PhD in comparative religions. My job is to study the religious phenomenon. And that has to do with the origins of religious experience. It has to do with, the varieties of religious experience. And when you spend your life studying religions, the first thing that you learn is to not take any one of them all that seriously. Which is why my field happens to be dominated by atheists, by people who may have started with some kind of faith, but then you start studying all these religions and you think, this is all bogus, and so what's the point of thinking about this in any other way except as a secular way? I don't think that way. I think what's remarkable about the study of comparative religions is this fundamental fact that people have been struggling with for the last century, ever since the concept of comparative religions was first defined, which is that in all cultures, amongst all people, within all religious traditions, in all parts of the world, and separated by immeasurable time and distances, people have always come up not only with the same answers to the same questions, but the exact same mythologies, the same stories, the same ideas. You look at, so in my culture in Iran, right, Zoroastrianism, Zarathustra was born 1,000 years before Christ. And this is a man who, whose prophecies involved, a virgin maiden who will swim in an ocean and who will be impregnated by the seed of God and will give birth to a salvific character who will bring about the end times. Sound familiar? You look at the Babylonian, flood mythologies about, the gods being angry at all the noise that people are making, and they can't sleep at night. So what do? They decide they're just going to kill everybody with a flood. But except for one guy. They're going to hold on to this one guy, and they're just going to get him to get as many animals as possible together on a giant raft. There are two ways to deal with this. One, you can talk about it in these academic ways, say, well, there are sociological, right, even psychological reasons why, the human mind has defined these questions of ultimate concern through similar stories and similar ideas. There's a reason why everyone comes up with the same answers to the same questions, because the brain is sort of hardwired in that way. That's a good answer. I don't have a problem with that. I've got another answer. Maybe the reason that we all have come up with the same answers to the same questions is because the source of those questions is the same. If you believe that there is actually a transcendent present, if you believe that there is something beyond the material realm, something that exists beyond that which I have empirical access to, then you have to recognize that that thing, whatever it is, has to be defined in human terms. You need language, you need symbols, you need metaphors to talk about it, because it's by definition indefinable. And the language, the ways that you talk about it, is what ultimately forms these religions. That's what religion is. Religion is just a language with which to talk about this sort of indecipherable, indefinable experience of the divine.
So we started off, and it was, if everyone remembers, there were the people on the shore and the people in the ocean. I want to read one of those poems that could be read either as to the beloved in a romantic way or the beloved in a spiritual way, just to end it, and you'll see what happens to that distance. It's called Far and Near. My heart drums a rhythm, your heart drums a rhythm, but distantly. Voluptuous spring will grace and depart the landscape like this, distantly. Stars will glimmer like this, distantly. Everything will stay like this, distant. But the taste of your desire, its savage music, will sit inside my heart, close. Okay, Kate, how are we going to do these questions?
Well, we've had lots of good questions, and we can't probably get to all of them, but we'll do our best. Several of the questions have to do with the role of women. So here's one that pertains to several of the cards. Where is the female voice in all this revolution? What future do you see for young women in the Middle East to participate in post-revolutionary governments?
Again, it depends on in the country involved. I mean, I think that there was a natural sense of disappointment that there weren't more women on the front lines of the Egyptian revolution, like there were in the Tunisian revolution, and there are no women on the front line of the Libyan revolution. And that primarily has to do with the fact that Libya is a far more tribal society. Whereas in Iran, it was all women. I mean, this was just like the entire front line was women. There's a saying in Iran that the only men left in Iran are the women. So it varies from country to country and society to society. But I do think that there is, it's important to understand that this youth movement has a very different relationship with gender dynamics than their parents do. It's a relationship born of the fact that they're far more globalized. And they recognize that the sort of traditional conception about the role of women in society that their parents' generation espouses is something that is antiquated. So the hope is in places like Egypt and Tunisia that there will be far greater access to positions of power, political and economic, for women, but that remains to be seen.
Okay, keeping in mind the colonist mistakes of the West and observing the struggles and current changes occurring in Africa and the Middle East and Iran, how can we give support and hope without imposing our cultures on these countries?
Yeah, I mean, this is really the delicate balance that I was talking about before. Obviously, these are regions in which the United States has not always played a very positive role. For the most part, we've treated much of the Middle East as our personal gas station. And the decisions that we have made in the name of national security and in the name of our economic interests have been very destructive for the people of the region. I mean, the reason that these countries that are our allies. So there was this really fascinating poll that came out in 2006, 2007, about the sort of attitudes towards the United States. And what it found is that in countries like Egypt, in countries like Saudi, in countries like Jordan, countries that the United States has very good relationships with. Those are pretty much our three closest allies in the Middle East, outside of Israel, of course. Vast majorities of the population loathed America. Loathed us. In countries like Syria and Iran, where we have no relationship at all, vast majorities loved us. In fact, anyone who's been to Iran will tell you that the thing that's, I think, most shocking for an American visiting Iran is just how much Iranians love America. And Americans, they're not crazy about our government, but whatever. So this is the problem, is that our relationship with the region has been so, almost singularly predicated on our needs and the exploitation of those needs, that we have created enemies out of the people. There is a way out of that, and I think it's important because we have a president who came to power a couple of years ago promising that he was going to change the very narrative of relations between the United States and the Muslim world, whatever that means, and has done a terrible job since then in doing that. An absolutely awful job, particularly with regard to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where I will say with all confidence, he has done the worst job of any president since Carter when it comes to that particular conflict. Now he's been given this gift on a silver platter. He's done nothing to bring about the movements that we've seen there, but he is in a position to reap all the benefits of it. Because these kids want a new relationship with the United States, but they're waiting to see how we're going to treat them. Are we going to treat them as allies? Are we going to come to their aid? Are we going to do what we do best, which is show up with a checkbook? If we do that correctly, then not only will we create a much more stable region, not only will we create a much more peaceful future, but we can completely reframe the perception of the United States in that region. We can show up as the heroes, much in the way that we did in Eastern Europe and the former Balkan states.
All right, this has to do with the Iranian film director Jafar Panahi. Okay. He's been imprisoned for 6 years and prohibited from making films for 20 years. Is there anything anyone outside Iran can do to prevent stifling creative movie making?
Well, specifically with regard to Panahi, yes, there is, as a matter of fact. I mean, make no mistake, the Iranian regime can be pressured. This is not an irrational regime, the way, say Libya is an irrational regime. I mean, we have a tendency, we want to think about Iran. We want to think about the Iranian regime as illogical or as irrational because it helps us feel better. It allows us to sort of, make decisions that whose consequences don't necessarily have to be applied if we think, well, they're not really rational. So specifically, I'm thinking about how to deal with Iran's nuclear ambitions. The irrational model says that Iran is a country in which mutually assured destruction cannot work because they're irrational. And so therefore, we need to do whatever it takes, including military action, in order to stop whatever their nuclear ambitions happen to be. But it's just not the case. They're very rational, they make rational decisions, and they can be pressured through international means. And they've been repeatedly pressured on a number of cases. So I think that there is room to continue building international pressure from the global community, particularly in Europe, to release Panahi himself. What can we do to stop the stifling of creative energies in Iran in general? That requires a rethink of the way that we have dealt with Iran over the last 3 decades. Our policy towards Iran has essentially been predicated on 3 things: sanctions, isolation, and containment. For 3 decades, the goal has been that if we just continue to sanction, isolate, and contain Iran long enough, eventually the government will fall. How's that working out? A tyrant stays in power by isolating his people from the rest of the world. For 3 decades, we've done the tyrant's job for him in Iran. You're talking about a population that's 70% under the age of 30. The literacy rate for women alone, just women in Iran, is 90%. Indeed, 60% of the college degrees go to women. This is about as sophisticated, as literate, as socially conscious a population of any country in the world, not in the Middle East, any country in the world. And yet, they have no access to the rest of the world. They have no way of actually, doing something with that creative energy, that they've got, because we are stifling it. Not just because the Iranian regime is stifling it, but because the rest of the world is stifling it. I agree with the idea of using targeted sanctions in order to try to pressure the Iranian regime. I agree that there are ways in which we can continue to isolate Iranian businesses and Iranian infrastructure, and especially its oil infrastructure, from the global community in order to use that to pressure the regime. But the notion that we can just sort of put a bubble around the country and create a situation that will ultimately lead to the downfall of the country, I mean, if something fails for 3 decades, eventually someone's got to be smart enough to raise their hand and say, how about something different? Obama said he was going to be that person. He said, in fact, in a very famous New York Times interview that he gave before he was even the Democratic nominee, he said that the first order of business when he becomes president is he will, A, publicly and explicitly take regime change off the table with Iran. Now that's very important because regime change has been our policy for 3 decades. And people are always saying, well, how come these, conversations and these diplomacies and these dialogues, they never get anywhere with Iran? There's a lot of reasons for that, but not least of which is the fact that one group in that conversation has as its stated purpose the removal of the other group from power. So just the notion of coming out as a president and saying that's not our objective, that's not what we're trying to do, would play a huge role in creating confidence. But also this idea that Obama has promised that he was going to really open up, Iran, not just engage in conversation. He's tried that, and it hasn't worked very well for reasons that are not his fault. But what I think he hasn't done enough is put all of America's efforts into promoting public diplomacy and allowing cultural exchange and allowing the technological exchange, giving these kids an opportunity to connect with the world around them. That's the only way that you're going to sort of release these creative energies.
Okay. Where do you feel the continued negative imagery of the Middle East and Muslims used within the United States will lead? So I'm thinking maybe from the media standpoint.
I don't think it'll lead anywhere. I don't think it'll lead anywhere more than it is now. I mean, it's already fairly mainstream. There have always been sort of the kooks out there, the Pamela Gellers, who state that Barack Obama is the bastard Muslim love child of Malcolm X. The Robert Spencers, who believes that the decision by Campbell's Soup to issue a line of halal soups is the first step in the Islamic takeover of America. Which, by the way, in that case is true. That's how we're going to do it, through soup. Those people have always been there. They will always be there. What's new is the Newt Gingriches of the world. The Mike Huckabees of the world. These are the two leading GOP candidates for president who have espoused in the most despicable, most bigoted anti-Muslim rhetoric. In the case of Newt Gingrich, this is a man who has repeatedly and explicitly blamed American Muslims for September 11th and said that, that American Muslims, are essentially Al-Qaeda. His rhetoric has been repeatedly this one form of the phrase. They attacked us on September 11th, and now they want to build a mosque at Ground Zero. Did you catch that? That's new. That's something that one would expect in Europe. I mean, in Europe, that kind of institutionalized mainstream Islamophobia is perfectly, acceptable. I mean, entire political parties, the British National Party, the Northern League in Italy, the PPV, the Freedom Party of Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, entire political parties in Europe are founded upon nothing more than let's get rid of the Muslims. That you expect in Europe. But when you start seeing that kind of thing happen in the United States, it's shocking. But it won't go any further than this. I think the important thing to understand is that every single word that's been said about Muslims, that they're un-American, that they're foreign, that they're exotic, that they're not like us, that they can't be trusted, that their loyalties can't be to the United States, every word that's been said about Muslims was said about Catholics in this country, was said about Jews in this country, was said about Mormons, was said about Quakers. It's what we do, and part of it, by the way, has to do with this sort of the elusive American identity. We are not a country that can define ourselves according to some kind of ethnic homogeneity. It's not ethnic. I mean, I was going to say there's no such thing as an ethnic American. There are. We just managed to kill most of them. But we do not define ourselves by our ethnicity. We do not define ourselves by a common culture. We certainly don't define ourselves by a common language, not where I live, in Los Angeles at least. But the way that we define ourselves is according to an agreement upon a set of common principles, which is beautiful and which has miraculously worked for 250 years, but which in times of crisis becomes difficult to sustain. And this is a time of crisis. It's a time of economic crisis. It's a time of political crisis. It's a time in which most Americans are waking up and recognizing that the United States is not the country that they thought it was, either on the global stage or domestically. And in those times of crisis, it's only natural for people to look to some opposite pole, against which to identify themselves. In the 19th century, it was Catholics. In the early 20th century, it was Jews. And now it seems very clear that it's Muslims. For a large swath of Americans, what it means to be American is to not be Muslim. And that's going to go away in the same way that we look at the anti-Catholic know-nothings, in the 19th century with shame and with derision and with a healthy dose of mockery because they're clowns. In the way that we look at the anti-Semitic bigots, of the 20th century, that's how we're going to look at these guys in, 10, 20 years. So I'm not worried about that. I'm also fairly confident that we'll find someone else by then to, I'm not sure who, probably the Chinese. I'm waiting for that.
Okay. Right now, Portland is considering rejoining the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but we are. And one of the key points of the debate is a negative bias towards American Muslims, Muslim Americans, and Arabs by the FBI. Can you comment on this debate, if possible, and what are your opinions on the American government's treatment of Muslims and Arabs at home and abroad? You kind of touched on that in the last question.
Well, look, I think it's important to understand that the FBI is quite sophisticated now about the way that it is dealing with the problem, or lack thereof, of radicalization amongst American Muslims. It took them a while. It took them a good decade to kind of figure out that, the way to do this is not just through, monitoring of mosques. Because as every single scholar who has ever spent 5 minutes studying this problem will tell you, mosques are not the source of radicalization. On the contrary, mosques are a source of conservatism. Mosque is the answer to radicalization. All radicalization, which is, whether it's happened here in the U.S. or in Europe, has happened outside of the mosque. So all the millions and millions of dollars that we've spent monitoring mosques for radical behavior has been a waste of money, because the mosque is where old people go to pray. I'm not making that up. I mean, 18% of American Muslims go to mosque. It's just not where young people get their spiritual edification from. They get it from MSAs and Islamic centers and student groups and things like that. But beyond that, I think that the FBI has kind of learned a lesson. They've done a very good job now of working with mosque leaders, with community leaders, and they're trying to build relationships with them, which is, by the way, why the FBI is not taking part in the Peter King hearings that are about to go on. The police department, the FBI want nothing to do with this. Congressman King, for those of you who are unfamiliar with this, is a Republican congressman who, when the Republicans were in the minority, had been railing about how there are, quote, too many mosques in America, and that Muslims need to be monitored, and that there's all this radicalization problem. And he promised that once he's in charge, once the Republicans take over, he'll start doing hearings to talk about the radicalization of Muslims. Those hearings start next week. And the witnesses that he is called is just sort of the who's who of the anti-Islamic right in this country, and he has invited. I mean, this is an FBI issue. This is what it is. He's invited FBI. He's invited the security people to take part in these hearings, and they've said no. They said it's a waste of time. It's it could do more damage than good. And in any case, we've got a pretty good relationship actually with the Muslim communities in the United States. So I understand the fear that when this proposal, this joint task force, was originally proposed, I understand the fear that a lot of communities, like in Oregon, had in wanting to take part in it. But things have changed now, and I think that the FBI is a little bit more sophisticated, and they could use the help from the community, actually, because they want it. They want it. They're good people. They really do want to work with these communities. They're not out to get us. And I think we should take them seriously and help them the best way that we can.
A lighter question. How cool is Jon Stewart? And how many times have you been on the show?
He is very cool. He is very, very cool. There's no question about it. I'll tell you something about Jon Stewart. He gets a lot of flack from the media because he's the most trusted man in news. But the reason he gets that flack is because what Jon Stewart has done is that he's made it impossible for people to watch the news anymore. You can't watch the news. You can't watch, CBS or NBC or Fox or CNN and take it seriously any longer. He's kind of pulled the curtain back, and that's a good thing. I think what he's done, the greatest benefit that he has done is that he has given people, particularly young people, a sort of a healthy awareness of the bullshit that they are fed on a nightly basis. And that's a good thing, because if you can see the bullshit, you can ignore the bullshit.
We've got 5 minutes. Okay.
I have like 1 minute of stuff at the end.
Okay. Well, then, can I ask my question?
Yeah.
You touched on the Palestinian-Israeli issue and what a terrible job has been done in this current administration. Could you share more of your thoughts about what should be done, or what?
In 4 minutes?
Well, no.
Yeah, 4 minutes.
Yeah, this will be one of those quick questions that we started with.
Okay, let me just ask the audience this question. Do you want the honest answer to this question?
Yes.
Or do you want what I'm supposed to say? Because the honest answer is going to take a while, and it's going to depress the crap out of all of you.
You have to get on an airplane.
I do have to get on an airplane. I'll give you the quick, honest answer. There is no peace process. There is no two-state solution. It's over. The idea that we can continue at a time in which there are now 500,000 Israelis living on what's supposed to be the future Palestinian land. And the fact that that number is growing at an accelerated pace, there's nothing left of Palestine. So you can't call it Palestine anymore because there's nothing there. It's just Ramallah, that's it. You're just going to call Ramallah Palestine, and then some deserts in the Negev and Gaza. Nobody wants Gaza. It's over. So this notion of, we need to figure out a way to revive the peace process. We need to figure out a way to revive the peace process. Don't believe it. The peace process is nothing more than a waste of time so that the rest of the land can become gobbled up. That's all it is. From when Oslo was signed, there were about 100,000 settlers living in Palestine. That's when the peace process started with Oslo. And 20 years of the peace process has led to 500,000 Israelis living on Palestinian land. It's over. The two-state solution is over. There is no Palestine. There won't be a Palestine. So what's next? Well, what's next is the horrifying reality that nobody wanted, and which is going to happen whether we like it or not, which is one state for two people. The binational state, which you only hear people like me ever talk about, you only hear, intellectuals and people who don't live in Israel talking about, because nobody wants this. The Palestinians don't want it, the Israelis don't want it, but the binational state, one state for two people, with clearly defined political rules, a president and a prime minister, perhaps a Palestinian president and an Israeli prime minister, in which you have a power-sharing deal and institutions necessary to maintain some kind of, independent national cohesion amongst the two groups. like we have in Belgium, for instance, or in Northern Ireland. Okay, now I know it didn't go all that well for a little while, and it's not going to be very clean in Israel-Palestine either, but it's happening. So I can't sit here and continue to say what I'm almost contractually obligated to say as a Middle East analyst, which is we must revive the two-state process and we must get back to the negotiating table. No, there is no negotiating table. There is no negotiations to be done. There could have been. There was a moment in which this president had the opportunity to change everything, and he drew a line in the sand, and then not only did that line get crossed, but it got crossed, and then his face was planted into the sand and spat upon, and he did nothing. What the Israelis did to the United States in waiting for Joe Biden to show up, last year. I was in Israel when he was there. It was the most embarrassed I've ever been to be an American. For the President of the United States, the most powerful man on earth, a man who provides $3 billion a year in American taxpayers to a first world nation, which is what Israel is, a first world nation. That comes out, by the way, to about $1,200 a year per Israeli. For him to make a request that the Israeli government should follow international law, the law that the Geneva Accords and every nation on earth has accepted, just for a little while, in exchange for even more money. And for the Israeli government to go tell him to go screw himself, which is what they did, is the lowest position I think American power has been vis-a-vis the Middle East as long as I can remember. Everybody now knows, who wears the pants in this relationship now. Everybody knows it. I'm sorry for the sexist comment. Everybody knows it. And for a man like Obama to make the promises that he made and to fail so utterly and so miserably, and ultimately to put the death knell in the peace process, because that's what he will be known for. He will be known for as the man who finally and ultimately put an end to the possibility of a two-state solution. And he did that, by the way, with a single vote last week in the United Nations Security Council by vetoing a resolution that said simply this, that Israeli settlements on occupied Palestinian land are a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. By the way, we've stated that numerous times. Obama has stated that numerous times, that these settlements are illegal under the Geneva Accords. Every nation on earth, including Israel, has defined these settlements as illegal. Actually, the Supreme Court of Israel has said that technically this counts as a military occupation. Therefore, since Israel is a signatory to the Geneva Conventions, they are in violation of the Geneva Accords. Every nation on earth accepts this. And for the United States to stand amongst 196 nations and say, veto, we're not gonna let this simple resolution even come to a vote, we won't let it come to a vote, was the death knell. That's it. That was the moment in which it's over. So it's time to stop thinking about the past, because that's done. It's now time to start thinking about what do we do from here. The one-state solution is messy. It's fraught with so many complications that we don't have time to talk about it right now. It will lead to bloodshed, of course, but there is no other option. It's happening. It's happening as we sit here anyway, so we might as well start getting ready for it.
Okay, 4 things. There's food. He's here for 25 more minutes, and I don't care what you're saying to him. In 25 minutes, he is leaving. Kate was very humble and pretended like this was not something that the two of us did together, so I'd like you to thank her. And finally, there's a Turkish film, I think it's called During the Sun, where Turk takes a Kurdish friend in a coffin, he's died, to his homeland. And at one point, he's on this abandoned road, and it's pouring out, and he doesn't know how he's going to get the coffin to the guy's hometown. And this car pulls up, and it's packed with people, and the matriarch in the car says, "We have to stop. We're good Muslims." And they stop, and they put the coffin on the top, and then they go off to the village. I don't want you to, the metaphor falls apart at some point, but Dr. Aslan knew me from no one. I didn't know anyone that he knew. I'm not in any vaguely formed Middle Eastern, and he decided to come here, so he stopped his car for us, and I want you to thank him.